I'm Greg Brown. I'm David Ivy, and this is Dynamic Discussions. This is another installment in the weekly video series we're bringing you about safety products and how to use them. This week, we have a special guest, Drew Hinton with Aero Safety. David has a question.
So, Drew, we want to know kind of what OSHA says about safety trainings. How often are they kind of required? What documentation is kind of necessary? But first, if you would, give us kind of a little background on yourself and Aero Safety, and then we'll roll into that question there.
Sure. I appreciate you having me on. Again, my name is Drew Hinton. I am the president and CEO of Aero Safety. We're a safety consulting and training firm. We're based out of Glasgow, Kentucky, which is south central part of Kentucky, but we do travel nationwide, and we're just about in every industry that you can think of. But to get to your question, there's the training that OSHA specifies, and if we'll get into the voluntary consensus standards later on, really varies by topic. But if we focus on fall protection, it's really going to be specific to your industry, right? So if we're looking at general industry, OSHA's 1910 standards state that the training has to be conducted by a qualified person. And if you look at the 1926 standards, it tells you that the training has to be conducted by a competent person. And so those terms are sometimes, skewed around and interchanged a little bit when they shouldn't be, because there are certain things that a competent person can do that a qualified person cannot, and vice versa. And so when you're getting into the qualified person, that's very specific to the type of equipment, to the type of task that you're doing. And so it's a little bit more focused. Competent person has a kind of a general knowledge and a little bit more authority, but they're having more broader knowledge. And so again, 1910 says qualified person, a competent person for 1926 standards. And then you get into the ANSI Z359 standards, and it kind of gives you a little bit more details on that. But what they require is, of course, before you're exposed to any kind of fall hazards, you have to have some kind of training based on what you're going to be doing. If you're going to be using fall arrest systems or fall restraint systems, or if you're just working in the area that has guardrails, then you have to be trained on that particular type of fall protection in your area that you'll be dealing with. And so that's before you're exposed to fall hazards. And then ANSI recommends every 2 years. ANSI 359 standard recommends refresher training at least every 2 years. OSHA doesn't really specify a certain time frame, but they do require you to have training in addition to the every 2 years. If there's any kind of changes in the workplace, so if you've changed policies, procedures, if you've changed equipment, fall protection equipment that is now something new or different than what you've used to be doing. And then kind of the catch-all statement, if I see you doing something that makes me have a reason to believe that your skills or training is inadequate, then we can send you through that one. And then, of course, a lot of companies, if there's any kind of incident, they'll usually send you through a refresher training. But just keep in mind that the refresher training is not always kind of the catch-all, fix-all, source for fixing all your issues, but it is a part of that. So again, every 2 years at a minimum is what ANSI states. And then, of course, if anything changes in the workplace, policies, procedures, equipment, so on and so forth.
So, Drew, you said you've been all over the country. You guys have a footprint in training in a lot of different places. What's the biggest mistake you see safety managers make?
Probably the biggest mistake, even as safety professionals, is not knowing, one, their resources, but not really looking into those differences. So one of those differences that we discussed just previously was the difference between a competent person and a qualified person. So they may use those roles interchangeably, and they may send somebody through a competent person course, but maybe they're not qualified to supervise a horizontal lifeline installation and project, right? So things that are specific to a certain type of task, certain types of issues. And so they're not looking at who can do those particular things. And the other issue is they'll look at, which a lot of manufacturers kind of taking this out of the equation, is the compatibility. There are some manufacturers out there that say that you can't really mix and match. And so maybe taking a harness from company A with a lanyard from company B. A lot of companies, I know Malta the same way, as long as a competent person evaluates those compatibility issues and says that it's okay based on their training experience, then you can go ahead and do that. But they're not really looking to see. Some companies will kind of take that out of the equation and just simplify it and say, hey, you have to have all fall protection equipment from the same company. It doesn't matter what company, but you just have to have it all together. So they're making sure that their contractors don't have to worry about that, even their employees. And so really making sure they understand what those roles and responsibilities are within the workplace, but also understanding your resources and how they can benefit you. Sometimes you may need to outsource it to a third party. Sometimes you can do it in-house. Just making sure that you know the difference between that competent person and that qualified person. And then what, like I said, the OSHA standards say. So like I said, 1910 versus 1926 construction standards, a little bit different on who can do that training. So making sure that you have that training as a trainer, in order to perform that training for your employees.
So from your experience, obviously you've been in the industry for a good while. So you're working with many companies out there. Like, how does a company fare, when they have a proper training, documented, versus when they are not? Because obviously documentation is a big part of it. People say, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. So kind of what's from your experience, what do you see out in the field?
Yeah, and that's going to vary from industry to industry. So, in my experience, and maybe people listening to this can relate, typically the construction industry is a little bit harder to document some of the on the field, out in the field or job site trainings. We may do toolbox talks, but those aren't really constituting a formal training. So we're still going to have to send them at some point through a little bit more advanced, maybe a little bit longer, authorized user training or a competent person training or qualified person training. It's not exclusively, but typically if you go into general industry, if you go to manufacturing and industries like that, it's a little bit easier because you have people in one spot, right? So we're able to get them together. But just like you said, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. I mean, we say that kind of religiously across the board, but that's true. If OSHA investigation does occur, they're going to want to see records of things. And if you don't have records of that, whatever kind of, if it's a certificate or just a training roster, then it's essentially going to be your word against theirs, and you're going to have to prove yourself to figure out, to prove to OSHA or whatever investigating agency it is that you did in fact do that training. And the more details, the better. And I've been involved with OSHA investigation as a consultant, helping a company out, and the more documentation they have, it's not saying that OSHA's going to look over things, but if I start saying here's pictures of us doing training, here's your rosters, here's a course outline, an agenda that shows everything that we covered, then they're like, hey, you guys are good. Let's go ahead and move on to the next topic, because obviously that you all have it taken care of here. So again, the more documentation, the better. You don't want to do overkill, but you still want to make sure that you are documenting what you have on there. And that ANSI Z359 standard, the fall protection standard, does give you a lot of good references to figure out what you need to put on that documentation, as far as if you're training them from general industry standards, or you train them to construction industry standards. Just simply putting fall protection doesn't tell me if you train them to 4-foot standard, 6-foot standard, who did the training, so on and so forth. So make sure that you're putting what standards they were trained against, and so that will help you out if there is an investigation, whether it's internal or external.
Great, very knowledgeable, all things safety. Drew, tell people how they can get in touch with you if they'd like your training service.
Absolutely. So we're all across social media, so you can find Aero Safety on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And so feel free to reach out to us, or you can go to our website. It's www.aerosafetyus.com, and we'll be glad to help you out or answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Drew. We appreciate it.
Thank you.